Well, there was a most extraordinary moment. I think, look to iconic moments in the law. This must be perhaps the most iconic of all. The king, for the first time, and you must remember that this was 3 months after the Treaty of Westphalia. And the Treaty of Westphalia had, which is in a sense the beginning of international law, had guaranteed, in effect, the security of all of Machiavelli's princes. It had ensured that no prince could be overthrown. But the great thing about the Treaty of Westphalia was that England wasn't part of it. It was a European treaty, and so there was no inhibition in putting the king on trial. And he was tried in Westminster Hall. I don't know whether how many of you have been to London and seen the Houses of Parliament, and this vast hall where it was the biggest hall in the country. It was where Richard II had been dethroned in Shakespeare's Richard II by Henry Bolingbroke. It was where Sir Thomas More had been put on trial, and now it was the venue for the trial of the king. And thousands upon thousands of people came to see the event, and the 70 judges trooped in with their black Puritan hats, and then the king was brought in, and he was very much a king in command. He had his plumed hat, which he refused to take off to acknowledge the court, and he looked round with absolute arrogance at these men who were to try him. And the prosecutor, John Cooke, who had drafted the indictment, stood up to present it to the court, and the king had a beautiful cane with a pure silver tip, and he hit the prosecutor on the shoulder as he stood up, and he said, "Hold." He was going to address the court, the king, but the prosecutor went on addressing the court to present his indictment. So the king hit him again, much harder, and said, "Hold." And he went on, continued. If he'd stopped, then the whole exercise would have collapsed. And then the king hit him very hard a third time, and the silver tip dislodged and fell between the two men. And the king, used to command, never had a command in his life that hadn't been honored, indicated to the barrister to pick it up. And the barrister refused and continued presenting his indictment. So the king, in front of 10,000 of people, we probably couldn't hear because the acoustics in Westminster Hall are terrible, they saw the king bend at the knee and scrabble round the floor at the barrister's feet to pick up his silver tip of his cane. And it was, as the newspapers the next day, and we are into, this is the first trial, that is, there were 24 shorthand note takers, there were dozens of newspapers, they were called Mercuries in those days, reported this is going to be very ominous. But for the first time, it had been the great argument that no matter how high you are, the law is above you. But it had never been a real argument until this moment when the king, before the sight of his subjects, bent to pick up the silver tip. Well, there was then the trial, and the king, very cleverly, on the advice of his lawyers, Matthew Hale, we still read Hale, those of you who do law remember Hale's pleas of the Crown are still mentioned, and Henry Bridgman declined to enter a plea. He said, as centuries later Milosevic was to say and Saddam Hussein was to say, "By what power do you try me?" He didn't. By what power do you try me? The judge, the only judge they'd found to conduct the proceedings, was a bit stumped by that, and he didn't say by the power that succeeded yours. He fluffed around a bit, and so there was, for 3 days, they had this long colloquy over by what power the new court could try him, and it was many centuries before a power to try someone who mass murders their own subjects was actually devised. But the king never pleaded, never entered a substantive plea, but he made the sort of mistake that prisoners still make. He talked to his guards, and on the way down after one session, he admitted to his guards that he never lost a moment's sleep over anyone killed in the Civil War. Now, when you remember that that war killed 1 in 10 Englishmen at a higher rate proportionately than those who died in the Somme in the First World War, you realize how seriously that affected people when it was reported to the prosecutor, when it was reported to the judges. It made them realize that this man was absolutely recalcitrant and there was no possibility of any alternative. They discussed whether they should put him in exile, they discussed all sorts of punishments. They were very reluctant, in fact, to order his execution, but they saw no alternative because the forces against them were gathering in Ireland and on the continent. So it came to pass that the king, having refused to plead and being given every opportunity, was, and the court having heard in a sentencing proceeding all the evidence against him of ordering the torture of prisoners of war and so on, decided to have him executed. This was, as it turned out, a great mistake because, of course, it made him a martyr. The sentiment that the English people still had, the vague belief that maybe he was divinely ordained, lived on. A great mistake to have the death penalty, which makes people martyrs, as we'll learn later on. But there it was. For 11 years, England was a republic, and the great gains that were made in the Civil War that were, in fact, endorsed or sealed by the execution of the king, the clock was never put back. But inevitably, the martyrdom of Charles I led to the restoration of Charles II in 1616. It's a long, sad story of how the Republic faded away. Cromwell at first stood firm against being made a king, but sadly he was persuaded to adopt pretty much kingly powers, including the right to appoint his successor. And who should he appoint but, of course, like a king, his firstborn son.